latitude, prevailing winds and ocean currents, mountains and the nearness to the sea. Things like that determine what we call the climate, determine what the climate of a place will be.
Welcome to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette Nestor
and Amy Munro-Ford.
Amy, great to have you back on the show. How have you been?
I've been good. Last week was really, really busy. We had lots of amazing internship applications to go through, and we've now offered all of them. It was, as I'm sure I have said before, just really inspiring to go through all these wonderful young people's applications, and I was really sorry I couldn't offer internships to an awful lot more of them. It was a really, really interesting process.
I actually had a very interesting week as well. Spoke to Jaideep Prabhu from the Judge Business School, and we talked about frugal innovation and how it relates to the circular economy and climate change and sustainability. So that was brilliant. And then I also spoke to James Morris, and he works in the insurance industry. And we talked about risk management and insurance and how basically everything, how we have to start looking at climate change or how quick we can insure against climate change. Is very interesting and topical issues that we don't really think about.
Brilliant. Well, I had a quieter week this week, but no less interesting. I went to go and talk to a student called Robyn Topper, who did her dissertation on looking at sustainable transport patterns in Cambridge. And we talked about what she found out and her research methods and how it's been studying throughout COVID-19. So it was a really interesting conversation as well, but coming from a completely different angle to the conversations that you had.
So Amy, should we listen to Jaideep about frugal innovation?
That sounds really interesting. Let's go for that.
Jaideep, thank you very much for joining us today. And for our audience, would you mind telling us your name and what you do at the Judge Business School?
Yes, I'm Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at the Judge Business School, where I also direct the Center for India and Global Business.
And can you tell us more about what you do with the Indian global business?
Yeah, so, the center was started perhaps about now over a decade ago to be a platform of engagement between research that's being done at the Judge and in Cambridge more generally, and policymakers and managers who have an interest in India, both from outside India looking in, but also from India looking out. And that is why we called it the Center for India and Global Business, to reflect that sort of a two-way traffic between India and the rest of the planet.
And within this, I've seen your book being advertised in many places called Frugal Innovation. Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, so actually, when we started the center, the first question we had to ask ourselves was what was the unique lens through which we were going to study India and global business? And we very quickly decided or realized that that lens should be innovation. This was for several reasons, partly because, my own research and a lot of the research of my colleagues in the Judge is on innovation. Cambridge itself is known for innovation, particularly of a kind of technology-led type. And India has prioritized innovation now for at least a decade as the way to deal with some of its pressing problems and to grow sustainably. So innovation became the lens, but we began to try to sort of think of something that was unique about the Indian approach to innovation. And so when we started to look carefully at how innovators in India went about their work, we were struck by how their approach seemed very different from their Western corporate counterparts. And in one particular way, it was very different in that it was very frugal. So typically in the West, particularly with large corporations through most of the 20th century, the model for innovation has been very resource intensive. You typically have large teams with big budgets working on long-term problems, often trying to push the technology frontier for the sake of doing so. And the fruits of that are products and services that are often very expensive. Now that approach is not feasible in India for two reasons. One is the resources aren't there typically. It's a very resource constrained environment. And secondly, you cannot afford to come up with things that are very expensive because most people will not be able to afford them. So that's when we sort of hit upon this idea of frugal innovation, and we studied entrepreneurs and innovators throughout the Indian ecosystem, from villages, grassroots entrepreneurs who were doing innovation, all the way to multinationals that had set up very large R&D centers. So, we realized that the Indian approach to innovation was very different from the Western approach, and that it was particularly frugal. Indian innovators were very good at doing more and better with less. So we wrote a book about that phenomenon, which we called Jugaad Innovation. Jugaad is the Hindi word to describe this kind of approach that people use in India. And in that book, we really looked at how Western companies that were going to places like India, going to resource-constrained economies, could learn from their counterparts in those economies how to innovate faster, better, and cheaper.
And in this context, can you apply this type of innovation to climate change and sustainability and the environment in general, or is it something that it can only be done in one area?
No, absolutely. So in fact, this book I mentioned that came out in 2012. And when it came out, we realized there was a lot of interest in that idea of frugal innovation in the West for the West. So my co-author and I started to look at the reasons for that. And we realized that one of the reasons why Western companies were now thinking about being more frugal in the West was because of issues to do with climate change. Increasingly, companies, wherever they are under pressure from governments and from consumers and civil society more generally to think about some of the environmental consequences of their business activity, the footprint of their products and services and their operations. So very quickly, our work from emerging markets then got extended to developed markets as well. And we started to look at how some of the world's largest companies were taking climate change quite seriously and innovating in their own ecosystems across the board to be able to meet their business objectives, but do that sustainably and reduce their footprint in the process. So I'd say there's a very intimate link between frugal innovation and sustainability, frugal innovation and, for instance, the circular economy, because we found that one of the linking principles between frugal innovation and sustainability was through this idea of circularity, where in the 20th century, the dominant model for companies had been linear. That is, they would take raw materials from the earth, make products and services from them, which they would sell to people, and then people would use them and then just dump them back. And companies had realized that that was inefficient and also unsustainable, and so were looking to adopt circular models where they would reduce, reuse, and recycle whatever materials that were going into the products and services that they make.
So do you think that there's actually a change in the way that businesses, big or small, are doing business and carrying out their everyday processes? Do you think is this a systemic change that is taking place, or is it still too slow?
There is certainly an attempt amongst companies, both big and small, to move to a more sustainable way of doing business. There's no doubt that many, if not all, companies recognize this. Now, this has taken a long time. I think there have been efforts to get companies to take sustainability more seriously for perhaps 3 decades or more. However, I'd say in the last 10 years, in the last decade, it has become clearer to companies that it is in their economic and business interests to become sustainable. So many of the companies we started to talk to interview and study, told us that it was clear to them that their own business models would have to change if they were to survive and become, so they would have to become more circular. Let me give you some examples. So if you take a company like IKEA that, makes furniture for homes, they recognize that the sustainability of that business, if they're going to be around in 10 or 20 years making furniture or selling furniture, then they have to secure their supply chain of timber, for instance. And that's a finite resource. And it's a resource that's also under a lot of pressure from competitors, because there are companies that compete with IKEA that are also, trying to get access to that scarce resource. So IKEA recognizes that if they're going to have a sustainable, regular supply of timber in, say, 10 years' time, they're going to have to do something about it. So one way is to make their own supply. So buy land, grow trees so that they have a reliable supply of timber. But another approach, more radical, is to move from selling things, what I call the sort of linear model, to a more circular model where they would perhaps rent furniture or lease it. And in that way, they would keep control of the raw material. They would lease it to you. And then when you were done with it, they would reclaim the asset, the physical assets, the timber, and then they would upcycle it or recycle it in some way. So you see that kind of logic entering into companies. You can see that logic entering into companies like automotive companies, where again, they require sustained access to the raw materials, the metals that go into cars. And so again, they are thinking of ways in which they can keep control of those assets by leasing cars rather than selling them, and then being able to recover the physical assets and recycle or reuse the assets in a car.
And do you feel that from a different angle, do you think that as consumers in general are not prepared to actually embrace all those changes? I mean, if companies may do all those different sort of adapt and innovate, but if us as consumers do not take up on all those changes, no matter what changes they make, it's not going to work. Do you think, or do you feel there is actually a change in consumer demand as well for these type of products and ideas and innovations in the market?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on a very important part of the puzzle, which is the role of consumers. Now, there are some consumers who are, we would say, more proactive. They are more actively thinking about climate change and how their consumption patterns exacerbate these issues or encourage these issues. And they are maybe at the forefront of making the changes necessary to put pressure on companies. And then when companies change, then, the consumers themselves change. But, that's still a minority. The majority of consumers, it would be fair to say, tend to be inertial and slow to change. They may, be inclined to say, let companies move first and make it easy for us to change our behavior. And so, that's a fair point. So I would say that, yes, companies should make the first move. But, when we interviewed companies, many of them said that they have done a lot within their own supply chains because it's in their economic interest. If they're able to reduce the amount of materials or energy that they need to use to make their products, then that actually reduces their own costs. If they can reduce the waste that they produce from their own processes, that again reduces their own costs. So actually many companies have become very efficient in their supply chains. But where a large part of the footprint occurs is in the home, when consumers like you and me use their products and services. So for instance, when we spoke to people at Nestle, they said, it's often the case that people in the home will boil an entire kettle of water just to make a cup of tea. Or if you talk to people at Unilever, they've done studies to show that people would shower for 10 minutes when they could shower 5 minutes with the same effects. So there is a lot of work to be done with changing consumer behavior. Some of that can be done by companies themselves, by changing their product design, changing the way they educate consumers in the use of their products and services. But in the end, a lot of the onus for that falls on consumers. And consumers need to be much more conscious about the way in which they consume, they buy, they use things, and they dispose of things.
So basically, I mean, we could demand much more from companies, but if we cannot take up onto what they're trying to give us as well, it has to be a two-way system. And it seems at the moment it's more like a one-way process than a two-way process. We made it say, yes, we need to stop carbon emissions, we need to do this or that. But in reality, not much of that seems to be happening on research experience, as you have mentioned.
Well, I would actually say it's a three-way process, because we've talked about two of the main players. You have the companies, of course, and you have consumers. And actually each type within companies, you have, perhaps more conservative incumbent companies that will find it harder to change, but you may have more energetic and agile startups that are actually driving the change. You have consumers, as we discussed, those that are more proactive and those that are more conservative or inertial. But there's a third group, which is regulation and regulators. You have the state as well, which plays a role. And I would say that the state can then, when it's clear what the sort of breakdown is in the system of communication, or whether, when there are so-called market failures, where the market alone will not solve these problems, where there isn't an incentive for companies to educate consumers, or consumers themselves don't have an incentive to change their behavior, then there is a case for the state to enter with incentives. Some of this can be, sort of simply quite blunt instruments, where they can punish companies, or they can ban certain types of products or certain types of behaviors. You have less blunt instruments, which are more to do with incentives. You can have tax breaks, or things like that. And then, of course, you could just have very, shall we say, so-called nudges, where the state just puts out messaging and encourages a particular type of culture. It encourages people to be much more conscious while they're buying and so forth. So I would say there's a third sort of set of players, and really it's the interplay between all these three groups that will ensure whether we are able to make a change in our economic system in time to avert some of the worst excesses of climate change.
And looking at the whole issue from a comparative perspective, do you see much differences between India and the UK, or there's actually a lot of parallels that you can draw in them?
Well, both. So, when you look at, if you look at the globe and you look at the types of economies we have, roughly we have the developed economies, and then you have the emerging economies, and then you have the frontier economies. And, the developed economies, are increasingly, their growth is sort of 1% to 2% at best. And this is pre-COVID. We have to see what happens post-COVID. The emerging economies were, for the most part, the drivers of global growth. And these were particularly the big emerging economies like China and India. And then you have the frontier economies of Africa, which will be the drivers of growth in, perhaps the next decade or more. So most of global growth is really happening in emerging markets like India. And the challenge, I would say, for the world is how can those emerging markets like India, which have more than half the world's population, how can those economies grow so that the standard of living of their people improves, and those people can get a quality of life that's roughly equivalent to those in the developed world? How can that growth happen without bankrupting the planet? That is the big challenge that the globe faces. So countries like India are at the heart of the challenge facing the globe. How do you offer a quality of life to all those young people entering the economy, but do so in a way that is not fundamentally destructive to the environment? I would say the problem or the challenge is particularly significant for emerging economies like India, China, Brazil, Nigeria, etc. But the developed economies also have a very important role to play, because they continue to have a very large footprint, and particularly per capita. So while in emerging markets we are trying to raise the standard of living, without damaging the environment. In the West, one could argue the challenge is how do we maintain the standard of living without damaging the environment. So there's a slight difference of emphasis, but the challenge is roughly the same, and the solutions, I would argue, are also the same, namely to innovate in a frugal way, to think about how we can do more and better, but with less.
Indeed, and that's the main question, how to do better and more with less. And in an ideal world, what would you like to see, perhaps, sort of, if you could have a magic wand or this magic ball that you could look into the future, what would you like to see 5-10 years from now, even more?
So, one of the things that I find is a sort of silver lining in all this, or cause for hope, is the awareness and not just the idealism, but very practical, I would say, drive and energy of the young people that we encounter in places like Cambridge, our students in particular. Something that I have noticed over the years of being here in Cambridge is how our students now, who come to a place like Cambridge from all over the world, wherever they come from, they are very aware of this challenge of climate change. Many of them are actually working on the science behind it. They also believe that they can make a difference, and that to do that, they need to sometimes form companies of their own. Many of them, while they're in Cambridge, actually work on setting up businesses, startups, which we support in the university through various means, and also in our business school through our accelerator. And these businesses that they are starting up are often directly intended to solve this problem we were talking about, improving lives while ensuring sustainability of the planet and scarce resources. Some of them are directly addressing that problem, but many are addressing it indirectly. So they might be trying to solve some other problem, but taking into account this problem of climate change. So for me, that is my source of hope. I believe that that kind of innovation, that kind of entrepreneurial activity coming from universities like Cambridge around the world offers a way ahead. And if you ask me what I would wish for, I would wish for those three groups that I talked about: the large companies, particularly the corporations, the consumers, and the government, to recognize the role of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs in making a difference, in coming up with these frugal solutions that will help us move to an economy where we are able to do more with less.
Excellent. And Jaideep, is there anything else that I've forgotten to ask you that I have not asked you yet, or something that you wanted to say?
No, I think we've covered everything, actually, because over the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at this issue, and really, my progression was reflected in those last 10 years, was reflected in these few minutes of our conversation, where we started with emerging markets like India. We understood how they were solving their problems through frugal innovation. Then we realized that there was a parallel challenge in the West. My co-author and I wrote a follow-up book called Frugal Innovation, where we looked at this problem from the perspective of the large Western corporation and how they were moving to a circular economy. And then most recently, I've started looking at the role of the state in driving this change, and I've just completed a book on the role of the government. So actually, in our few minutes of conversation, we covered my own sort of trajectory and thinking on this topic over nearly a decade.
So Jaideep, thank you very much. It has been excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it.
So if you've just joined us, you're listening to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks.
And Amy, where do people get in touch with us?
And if they want to get in touch with us, they can email us at info@zero.cam.ac.uk.
Now, I'm very interested to learn about transport and transport patterns. It seems like the work that Robyn did very relevant to today's environment.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really, really good chat. So over to Robyn.
So today I'm talking to Robyn Topper, who last year did an internship with the Living Lab for Sustainability. And we're here today to talk a bit about her interest in the environment, her internship, and what she's done since. So firstly, Robyn, are you still based in Cambridge? And can you tell us what you're studying?
So I've just come to the end of a 3-year undergraduate degree in geography at Cambridge. Unfortunately, at the moment, I'm obviously based not in Cambridge. I'm in my home, I would say village, but I pretty much live in the middle of nowhere in Norfolk.
Brilliant. Could you tell me a bit about how you first got interested in climate change and the environment?
Yeah, so I think that around about, I want to say year 8 or year 9, so like high school, I started really enjoying kind of like my geography lessons. It's quite a typical route into it and probably quite circular, given that I now have obviously just done a geography degree. But I had an incredible teacher throughout most of my high school, and then obviously I had another incredible teacher actually afterwards, the sixth form, and they really kind of opened my eyes to geography as, you know, being much more than rivers and deltas and kind of the physical aspects that I think it gets bundled together as a lot. And obviously a huge part of that, and something that's really just been a continuous feature throughout my geographical learning experience, has been climate change and the environment. And I think it was quite not really a slow realization. I think it was quite an emotional realization, especially at that age. It took me a while to kind of connect the dots between different aspects of like environmentalism, so that I kind of started changing actually my lifestyle, because I realized I feel so passionate about this, and kind of the rabbit hole I've gone down of being aware of climate change, that I should probably start making lifestyle changes. But yeah, that's with the beginnings, and obviously I still feel very strongly about it today.
Brilliant. So changing track slightly, this term's obviously been really unusual in terms of teaching and exams. How have you found adapting to the change?
Yeah, it's been a very unique term. Obviously, the phrase unprecedented times has been thrown around a lot in emails and kind of like correspondences with my director of studies and other staff. I will say actually that one of the great things that I guess isn't necessarily continuous, because it's been a different form of communication, but the support we've as a kind of cohort received from the university has been really great, and they've definitely stepped up to the mark, because obviously I guess you don't have that separation of libraries and home, like kind of work and leisure space at all when you're working from home. And I think I'm very lucky in a way, because I have my own desk, I have, you know, all my own things, but it's still been very interesting, especially technology wise, in terms of kind of online exams. I had a few blunders with late submissions that I thought I'd submitted, which hadn't actually submitted, and panicked emails. But I guess one of the virtues of it being all based online is that everyone's very responsive to emails. And yeah, I've kind of adjusted to the Zoom. And to be honest, I think that in the future, next year, I can't see why virtual kind of learning won't go further. It's been a bit better than I've expected, but I also think that Cambridge will never lose that kind of in-person value added aspect as well.
So again, moving on slightly, last year you did an internship with the Living Lab, which was when we met. Could you tell me a bit more about the project that you did?
Yeah, so I was with the transport team, for 8 weeks, and my project was based around a set of postcode data from human resources. It was a very open-ended project in the sense that the data that kind of the transport team wanted me to get from it was very much up to my own kind of learning and figuring out experience, and what I could try and extract from the journeys and the routes people were taking, the times of day, based on kind of the travel survey. And yeah, I used mainly ArcGIS tools for that, which I wasn't actually that familiar with, so it was great to have. I was familiar with QGIS. It was great to develop my skills in that, and also working towards a deadline, report writing, and I produced a presentation and a kind of extensive report of my kind of ideas to do with it. So I looked at propensity to cycle, kind of average distance journey times, and like popular routes. And then I also had a side project that kind of got merged in halfway through to do a mini project for the university's bus routes and investigating kind of disparity between different colleges in their travel times to different key sites, which was really interesting, obviously, as a student myself, to look into that a bit more.
Absolutely. And in terms of both of those projects, what were your main findings?
So my main findings, I'm not really sure how much I can say about the kind of student-based one, just because I'm not sure, because it went to senior management, but that was kind of quite as expected, but I guess it's obviously good to have the hard data there, which was the implications of the changes to the universal bus route, obviously for disabled students and for students who live quite far out, who are quite reliant on public transport. The outer colleges were across the board the longest times and the most expensive, because obviously the universal bus is subsidised, and the alternative bus routes were more expensive for the students. There was kind of an interesting element there. And then in my main project, I found out a lot of interesting things. One main thing actually being that the majority of staff do live within about, I think it was a 10-kilometre radius of Cambridge, probably even less, which I think personally was surprising, just because learning from it from a geography perspective, I know a lot about kind of land prices and austerity and, you know, the wealth inequality in Cambridge, and I was kind of expecting perhaps a lot more people to be commuting from satellite villages, which they were. However, I think a lot of staff, probably fellows and perhaps researchers, were living inside, like, basically Cambridge itself. Which obviously then poses a lot of kind of further questions, which it would have been great to go into, like housing prices and, you know, whether there was a concentration of researchers in different areas or different types of university staff in different areas. But yeah, it was really interesting to look into that a bit more.
Great. And following on from your internship, I know you've developed your research into this more extensively through your final year dissertation. Could you tell us more about your research and how that developed from what you did with the internship into something slightly different?
Yeah. So obviously the data that was provided to me in my internship was super interesting, and I could talk about it much more, and I've probably already talked about it a bit, but it definitely made my mind go in many different routes, and it was at a great time because my dissertation was, I was doing it that summer, and I obviously loved my internship and really realised that I was super interested in transport, and it was very geographical, obviously. And actually, I can talk about it more, but I've now gone kind of down the transport route in my career. But yeah, so I had this amazing data set, which was very kindly, I was very kindly permitted access by yourself, which obviously had its own. I remember we went over our data kind of morals and ethics, which was really good to make sure, because it was obviously highly confidential. And based on that and what I'd seen in terms of the modal split of staff, I noticed that lift sharing specifically was minute compared to single car drivers, and that obviously kind of made me think, okay, well, what actually is lift sharing? I mean, I know what it is because my manager at the time in my internship, Sarah, was coming in every day lift sharing. And I think just lots of pieces slotted together, because I really needed to narrow it down from just transport in Cambridge, which it was at one point, which was a bit huge. And I looked at lift sharing and propensity to share amongst staff at the university. So it actually became quite qualitative. I interviewed a lot of members of the environment and energy team and kind of investigated several themes as to what kind of are the main barriers and incentives to people who might share, not necessarily from the perspective of, you know, disseminating a sharing culture, but I think specifically for Cambridge, a lot of people are forced to drive because of where they live. Well, not necessarily forced to drive, but a lot of people, for them, driving is the cheaper option or the easier option. And there's so much literature on the automobile society and like how we've become, you know, so car ingrained and have that flexibility. So it was really interesting to me to think about what kind of like personal values, whether it's a case of personal values and like what pushes someone to want to kind of share that space, which for a lot of people can become, very personal going in and into and out of work. And I found a lot of things. I found that people are generally quite resistant to sharing that space, because if they're in the position to kind of use public transport and a bus, a lot of people are quite green-minded, I say kind of in quotations, at the university. Although, to be fair, not actually as many as I would have thought, perhaps, for Cambridge. And yeah, it opens up quite a lot of interesting questions as to where the future of transport in Cambridge is going or should go.
Great, that's really, really interesting. And you mentioned something about your future career as well. Could you tell us what you're going to do next?
Yeah, so fingers crossed. I haven't heard anything differently at the moment, but I have got a graduate role at a transport consultancy called Steer, which is based in Leeds and London, and I'll be in the London office, which I'm so excited about, genuinely. I never thought I'd be able to kind of combine a career that has such a strongly geographical element and really resonates with me. Like, I really enjoy GIS. I'm admittedly not, I would have done probably a GIS degree if I was the best ever at it, but I love it, and I'm really excited to be able to get the skills to learn more and actually problem solve in a working environment.
Fantastic, excellent. So moving on slightly, something that we talked about outside of the context of this interview is about the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on transport, and for example, but also how society works more generally. Based on your research, and this is very much an opinion-based question, but do you think there'll be ramifications in terms of travel in the future and how we travel for work and study, and how that might affect students and maybe people more widely as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, given I was kind of working on my dissertation at the time this is all coming out, and I'm not sure if I kept it in, but I think I put a kind of afterword in, which is kind of about COVID and thinking about, I've obviously premised my entire dissertation on the fact people are willing to share space regardless of, the external factor of health, which is obviously going to massively impact, I think, our willingness to be in proximity to each other. Which could have really devastating effects for the future of public transport. Probably not for cycling, could be really positive for cycling. Obviously, it's a very active sport, active commute and way of transport. It is really interesting. I think for Cambridge, there's already such a kind of almost crisis going on in transport. It's historically like a tiny city, and it's growing well beyond its existing transport infrastructure. So it's definitely a critical moment to intervene in a environmentally kind of positive way, and not just facilitate the building of huge car parks on the outskirts of the city and making those awful arterial roads even worse to get into in the mornings. For students, I don't think I almost feel like it's a bit of not a non-issue per se, but obviously coming into university, like at the start and end of term, is problematic because it's a bit of a nightmare as it is. But we obviously aren't really allowed to have cars at Cambridge, which I know is quite unique to a lot of other universities. So I think the implications will be felt more for public transport, and that kind of bit of research I'd done into kind of Girton and Homerton and the far out colleges like Wolfson, I think that's where people will see it more, and actually especially kind of disabled students, and it'll be kind of more of an access perhaps issue, which is something that I don't think gets considered as much as it should do. Yeah, definitely an interesting time though for transport.
Fantastic, that's really, really interesting. Have you got anything else that you'd like to say before we finish off?
No, only just a massive thank you for, I guess, recruiting me as an intern last summer. It was a really amazing 8 weeks and just really fun and enjoyable. Didn't really feel like work. It just was so nice to come in and be in Cambridge. The weather was gorgeous, and such an added bonus that I was able to kind of go on and do my dissertation, and it's obviously then led to a job, and it's just, it's been fantastic. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, that is a total pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
Excellent. And I suppose, transport, you can also see how transport and risk management how it can be affected by climate change and weather patterns So I think it's just appropriate then to listen to James Morris and what he had to say. James, thank you very much for joining us today. And for people that are listening to us, would you mind telling us your name and what you do, please?
Sure. So my name is James Morris. From a job perspective, my current role is that I'm the head of security services for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Aon.
When it comes to risk management and the insurance sector, you're trying to build a greater interest in the security impacts of climate change across the security and risk management sectors. So can you tell us more about this?
One of the big misconceptions often about security in particular is really what the security industry does. And particularly, so I work in physical security. A lot of people now, when they think about security, they immediately think about cybersecurity. But my background is it's physical security. And often when you ask people what they think of when they think of physical security, they often think of a guy wearing sunglasses acting as a bodyguard, or you think about gates, or you think about access control systems or CCTV. And the industry itself, we like to joke that what we do is guns, guards, and gates, because it's quite a narrow view of actually what we do. But the reality is that good security, when you're supporting an organization, is about managing risk. It's about enabling business to operate. And ultimately that means creating an environment where a company and its employees and its customers and the people it interacts with can do business safely wherever that happens to be. And really, when it comes to climate change, really what we're talking about is enabling business in an environment that's fundamentally changing. That the world that we're looking at is really changing, and as a result, the security industry has to change the way that we operate to be able to enable business. You can't. I don't think you can think of climate change now without seeing this existential threat coming over the horizon, and as a result, the way businesses have to operate has to change, and ultimately, from a security perspective, to enable business, that has to change as well. So oftentimes we don't really think about climate change as a security threat, but in my view, it's certainly something that we need to be considering much more than we have been in the past. So very early stages of this discussion, because often when we think about security threats from a climate perspective, we think of international security. So, as an example, I think it was 2010 that the US Department of Defense first started talking about the security implications of climate change. And that was, I think, a bit of a change in direction. So the UN Security Council started talking about it, but it's still very much focused on international security, whereas actually the threats to business and the internal threats or national threats from security from climate change are real. It's hard sometimes to demonstrate the direct link between climate change and security, but we often think of climate change as a threat magnifier for security threats. And I think ultimately what we'll see in the near future, is more and more companies considering the security threat, the risk management implications, and the crisis management implications of climate change.
And in your experience, is this type of risk management, is it coming more and more aligned? Are more people asking you, what about climate change? What about risk management in relation to climate change? Are you having more clients asking you about this, for example, if you're working in this type of area or not? What has your experience been?
There's a couple of reasons why we're starting to see more conversations around climate change when it comes to risk, and that's ultimately because increasingly regulators are expecting companies to consider climate change. I was at an event last year when we could still physically go to events, and it was a risk management conversation around climate change. And one of the regulators was talking at the event, and they said firmly, in our mind, there is no longer a discussion about whether climate change is real. It's real. It's a threat. It's something that we are seeing and we are having to manage. The conversation now isn't whether it's a threat. It's about what are you doing to reduce your exposure to that particular threat and that risk. And there's an expectation increasingly that climate change impact and climate change mitigation is owned by somebody at a very senior level within the organization. It has to be owned by somebody at the C-suite, at the executive level. So I think increasingly companies are realizing that they have to think about climate change. Now, often the way that businesses operate is that they're driven by threats, opportunities, and ultimately by the bottom line, by profits. but again, I don't think it's hard to imagine now an environment where climate change has such a phenomenal impact on the profitability of organizations that you have to consider the risk of climate and what that does to your business. There was a news article that came out sometime last year that talked about PG&E in the US being the first company to go bankrupt as a result of climate change, but they're unlikely to be the last. And I think more and more companies will be in a position where they have to consider the impact, and that's across the whole range of the whole spectrum of climate change. We have to change the way we operate. There are opportunities if we act early, but ultimately the way we operate has to change. And I think that, for me, from a risk management perspective, is going to be something that we're talking about it more, but it's going to be driving the conversation more and more in the future. The way we fundamentally operate is going to change in the future because of climate change.
So do you think that the lessons learned from the current pandemic can actually be applicable to climate change and how we move it forward? I mean, is it something that you can really, without mentioning what the risk is, can you actually put the two of them side by side and say, look, this is what we have to look at. This is what worked what is working or has worked for the pandemic. This is how climate change should be tackled in the risk management sector.
Yeah, I think you can. I think ultimately every time you have a crisis, it's an opportunity to learn, and it's an opportunity to look at what you've done and what you could do better. And there's the old adage to make a mistake once to make a mistake once is human, to make it twice is unforgettable, or something like that, whatever the quote is. But the fact is, you see something coming, and you come to the end of a situation, and you review how you responded, and you think about what we could have done better in the future. There's a number of examples, I think, that are opportunities for companies to learn from what's happened in COVID and apply that to the way they operate in the future. That is ultimately going to be beneficial for the way that they operate as climate change becomes a bigger and bigger threat and has more and more of an impact on the way we operate. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but ultimately you're talking about learning. One of the biggest impacts that COVID has had on a lot of international organizations is on their supply chain. Now, if you look at what's something that's likely to be impacted by climate change in the future, it's going to be your supply chain. So do you have resilience in your operation? Do you have resilience in your supply chain? Do you understand where the weak links are in your organization and how to strengthen that moving forward to ensure you're not impacted?
In relation, I was thinking about when you were talking about predicting future events, predicting sort of, for example, weather patterns or what's going to happen with the climate. So how can you actually ensure or offer a risk management when you don't really know what's going to happen in the future in relation to climate? Do you actually just sort of like foresee this might happen, and we, for example, it says like company A and say, look, I have a crop. Can I be insured for my crop, but knowing that you don't really know what's going to happen with the weather? So how do you deal with that?
That's a really great question, because that's the ultimate challenge when it comes to risk management, right? It's the balance, and I think companies, and I'm talking a lot about companies, but the reality is this is countries, this is cities, this is, when you're talking about climate, you're talking everything from the micro to the macro, because that's really where the range of impacts lie. But from an organization perspective, it really does require a total rethink on the way that you approach the risk management process that you undertake. And it's really about understanding what your company is, how you operate, and what are the critical elements of what you do. I think of a story when it comes to COVID. So I like ice hockey. I love sports in general, but I particularly like ice hockey. And during the early stages of the lockdown in parts of China, the National Hockey League in North America suffered a major shortage of hockey sticks. So it would be like the Premier League football team running out of footballs. It was that kind of impact, because there were essentially 3 major companies in the world that supplied hockey sticks to North America, and 2 of those companies were based in China, parts of China that were under lockdown. So you have this billion-dollar industry in North America that was impacted by supply because essentially all of their eggs were in 2 baskets that happened to be sitting very close together. so that's a critical impact. Now, I'd like to think that in the future, the National Hockey League will probably diversify where their manufacturing is happening and understand that you can't really play hockey without hockey sticks. So that's something that we have to focus on, and you have to ensure that that's safe. But really, it comes down to understanding what are your critical assets. What is the most important thing that you do? What are the most important things that you protect? And that's obviously usually your people. But how do you continue to do business? And if what you do is so focused on a couple of links in the chain, then even if somebody was to tell me that there is a 5% chance that those two links are going to be impacted, I'm going to build a really big wall around those things. So it's about understanding how this impacts. If your company if the ability to operate of your company is dependent on one key crop, then really what you have to do is focus on protecting that one key crop. And go back to COVID again, companies that I think responded well realized that in December and January of this year that something was going to happen, and we need to do something to protect our assets, whether that's just reviewing our policies and procedures or reviewing our plans. They responded to that. And again, I think moving forward, risk management is going to be about, okay, these are the things that are coming across the horizon. This is the one thing of those four that's going to have that could have a really serious impact on the way we do business. So as a result, we need to ensure that our factories aren't being built on floodplains, that our critical crops aren't likely to be impacted by severe weather, and there's food insecurity challenges to what we're trying to produce. The way that food companies operate are going to have to change, because they're going to have to be diversifying where they're planting their crops. You're going to have manufacturing companies that are operating in different environments. I think it's really about understanding what you do and understanding the risks to those elements.
What about, do you think there is a culture change needs to be done as well into how business are carried out at the moment? I mean, you hear sort of the cliche, we need to create a new way of doing business. We need to rethink businesses. But how is that happening at the moment?
It's interesting because a lot of people talk about the new normal, but we don't really know what that is right now. I do think that at the early stages of COVID, and as different countries and organizations were going into lockdown, and it was having a huge impact on people around the world, we did talk a lot about the new normal and what that looks like. As we in the UK are starting to open up more, actually we're just going back to the old normal. That the new normal, I don't think is quite as clear cut as we might have thought it was in the past. But there are a lot of unknowns here. So we're starting to open up. Businesses are starting to reopen. Companies are starting to open their offices again. We've got people going back to physical offices. Now the big challenge, of course, is what happens if we get hit by the second wave, and how companies respond to that, and how governments respond to that. There are undoubtedly some adaptations to the way we operate that are going to come out of this process, and I think they'll ultimately be for the better, because I think one of the things that this has created is it's an environment where companies who may have been thinking about innovation and switching to more work from home environments and using more technology have been forced into doing it, and they've realized it's not as hard as you thought it was. You have to deal with, but a lot of companies have realized that you can continue to operate at a fairly high capacity in this new environment. You just have to be a little bit smarter about how you operate.
And you mentioned innovation as well and new ways forward. Seen and heard a lot on the news and in social media about the green jobs, green recovery. Would that actually also involve something different when it comes to risk management and the insurance sector of how you insure green businesses, for example?
There's definitely going to be a requirement for innovation within risk management to support innovation in wider industry. I would say in the past, we might have been more inclined to say, well, you have a property insurance policy for your physical office building. Well, why can't you have a property insurance for your wind farm or for your solar energy farms? And they're not the same thing. And I think ultimately, again, the insurance industry is about innovation. It's about designing products that are better designed to support the way we work. So there'll definitely have to be some changes, and there'll have to be changes in products that are produced, and the way we ultimately calculate the risk, we calculate the cost, we calculate how to support new businesses. So I definitely think it's going to create change. I think one of the key elements is ultimately understanding what are the critical elements of your new line of business, because an office isn't the same as a solar farm. Any kind of green industry is going to be different and has to be looked at differently. With my security hat on, I also think that as we move forward, as we build hopefully a greener economy and more green business, and as we build hopefully more renewable energy resources, that also has fundamentally changes the way we operate from a security perspective as well, because again we're dealing with things we may never have dealt with before. One of the things again that I think about from a security perspective when it comes to increased reliance on renewable energy is how does that change traditional security thinking around threats like sabotage? How does that impact the way how does that impact crime? If you think about climate change, one of the second or third order impacts of climate change, and from a security perspective, is if we are seeing increased forced displacement, if we're seeing increase in job losses and food insecurity, and if we're seeing if that causes increase in civil unrest and economic unrest and social unrest, well, one of the likely outcomes of that from a security perspective is increased criminality. So how does that impact new businesses?
And as a last question, James, if you could see into the future, what would you like to see?
If I'm honest, I still feel like there is whether it's a lack of understanding or a lack of willingness to accept that climate change is real. And I think that really for us to thrive as a society, there has to be an acceptance that climate change is here. We've talked for a long time about stopping climate change. Well, climate change is here. Like, we can't stop it. It's here. We're dealing with some of the effects of that already. How do we reduce the risk of the worst effects while also managing the risk that we are already facing and the impacts that we're already facing? I think that's a significant question. And there's a great quote that I think of. I read it the other day, and I can't stop thinking about it now. I think it was Aristotle said that a great society thrives when old men plant trees under whose shade they'll never sit. Well, I kind of feel like that's how we approach climate change. What we do today isn't likely to benefit us today, but it's going to benefit future societies. It's going to benefit your kids, my kids, other people's kids. But it's what we have to do. And I feel like there's such an urgency now to accept that today is the day we have to do things. We have to be doing more and more, and there has to be a seriousness about how we respond. I see the way businesses are trying to restart the economy, and governments are trying to restart the economy as a result of COVID, and it doesn't make me feel particularly positive about that we're taking that threat seriously. But I would really love to see that we finally start treating climate change like the threat that it is to every single one of us.
So that's me and Antoinette signing off, and we will see you next week.
Goodbye. Have a great week.